How we doing? Breck Aramella here. Today I'm going to look at the footage with my Air 2S and the Mini 3 Pro. Now this comparison is going to be in 4K, both at 24 frames per second and 60 frames per second. So we're going to jump right into the video and look at the footage that I shot. And I have it on this monitor because it's calibrated. I can look at it big. It's a lot more accurate than looking at my laptop. Links to all my gear is in the description below, but this is an EZO monitor. So in this first part, it's 24 frames per second in 4K. Now these drones both have a fixed aperture, so I couldn't change the aperture. Obviously the Mini 3 Pro has 1.7, so it lets more light in. Other than that, I used an ND filter. I try to keep it at 100 all the time, so it'd be a fair comparison. And then I put on an ND filter when needed. Obviously to keep the shutter double the frame rate. So when I shot 24 frames per second, it was 1/50th of a second shutter speed. Later in this video, when I shot 1/60th of a second, it was at 120th of a second. So let's jump into the video, and now we're gonna see 24 frames per second in 4K. And this is the default settings in H.265s in normal color for both of the drones. So let's go have a look. All right, so looking at them side by side, what I did notice, first off, the Air 2S is an f2.8 lens. The Mini 3 Pro is 1.7. So I did notice a little more detail on the Mini 3 Pro in the shadows. Maybe that was from having more light come through the lens, but it has a smaller sensor. So I thought it would actually be the opposite, that the Air 2S would have more detail, more dynamic range, but it looks like the Mini 3 Pro has more dynamic range and more detail in the shadows, which I was very surprised. And then there's the focal length where the Mini 3 Pro had 24 millimeters, but the Air 2S had 22 millimeters. But side by side, I had to move the drones in different places. So I moved one way further back than the other. What I noticed was quite a bit of a difference. So I had to have the Mini 3 Pro a lot further back and the Air 2S a lot forward to make it look the same side by side, as you can see in the comparison. I like the Air 2S being a little wider. I did like that. By the way, I did have my friend Austin filming with me, so he helped me out, and that way we were able to film side by side. Although at the very end, when I shot in D-Cine-like and D-Log mode, I did that all myself, which is kind of crazy, flying two drones simultaneously. But other than that, I flew with my friend, and we tried to match it up so the footage looked almost exactly the same. So I had to use a darker ND filter on the Mini 3 Pro because it let so much light in with the 1.7 aperture. And even then, it still looks a little brighter to my eye, or a little more detail in the shadow. And it also looks a lot warmer. So I kind of like the warmer feel to it, which is the Air 2S looked a lot cooler. Now you may be thinking, oh, do you use auto white balance? No, I use custom white balance. I set my white balance at 5600 Kelvin, which is daylight balanced. And even doing that, the Mini 3 Pro looked a lot warmer, as you can see in all the footage. I used all custom settings. I didn't do anything in auto. That way it was a controlled environment and it was a fair comparison. Now obviously I realize there's no perfect comparison, but I did my best to make it as good as I could. Okay, with that said, now we're gonna look at 60 frames per second. Since I'm using a 24 frame per second timeline in Premiere Pro, I slowed the footage down so it almost looks like it's not moving. We were flying the drones, and the whole point of this video is to see the image quality side by side. So I'm gonna play it right now. So here's some other observations. Obviously 60 frames per second, the image quality still basically the same as 24 frames per second because we're shooting in 4K with H.265, the same settings, etc., etc. What I did notice looking at them side by side is that the Mini 3 Pro has a little too much sharpening, so you might get some alias and moire in your images, whereas the Air 2S doesn't really have that as much. The Mini 3 Pro, I know a lot of people like sharpening, especially like beginners and people who don't do a lot of color grading, things like this. It is very good. I mean, the image quality is exceptional for such a small drone, but it's a little too sharp for my taste. But again, I'm pixel peeping, and most people don't have a huge monitor like this. On a laptop, and especially on a phone, it's gonna look great. You're not gonna be able to really tell the difference. The image quality almost looks identical side by side. But I will say, looking at the footage, I noticed I was flying the Mini 3 Pro a lot faster and closer to objects. So that, to me, that looks a lot cooler. And the reason I did that is because it's a lot quieter. So the Air 2S is much noisier compared to the Mini 3 Pro. So with the Mini 3 Pro, it's smaller and it's very quiet. So you're able to get close to objects, fly in real tight situations. For that reason alone, the way I fly now, I kind of prefer the Mini 3 Pro for that reason. But in super windy conditions, the Air 2S is gonna perform much better. So when I was flying over that bridge, I don't think anybody really noticed it, but with the Air 2S, I didn't get too close. Whereas the Mini 3 Pro, I got really close down by the lampposts and really close to the people, and they didn't even notice a drone was there because it's so quiet. So that's one advantage with the Mini 3 Pro. With the Air 2S, you might get a little more detail in the sky with the clouds, and the highlights might not be as overblown. You don't get as much detail in the shadows. Now in the final comparison, I'm gonna shoot D-Cine-like with the Mini 3 Pro. That is in 10-bit, and then 10-bit log with the Air 2S, and compare them side by side. And then I'm gonna color grade them side by side. Basically, I just added my LUTs, which if you join any of my courses, those LUTs are included, links down below. But for this comparison, since they're so close, I think it's real interesting to see what they're gonna look like in 10-bit, both with D-Cine-like and 10-bit log. And I shot that mostly in 4K, 24 frames per second, but I also did it a little bit with 4K, 60 frames per second. So let's go have a look. So in this final side-by-side comparison, the Mini 3 Pro just looked better to my eye. I really like the colors. They just seemed a lot more natural and real, whereas the Air 2S just seemed too cold. It all depends on personal preferences. I prefer a little warmer tone, but if you like a little cooler tone, the Air 2S is better. Obviously you can change that, but this is the starting point. So the Mini 3 Pro is a lot warmer and the Air 2S is a lot cooler in tones just right off the bat. And one of the things I did notice, the over sharpening, you can see it in the building. Any type of pattern, it really is too much sharpening, and you can notice it in the buildings. I noticed it with the Mini 3 Pro. It was quite bad, and it was also quite bad with the Air 2S as well. I think DJI over sharpens its images as a whole. I wish the images were a little softer, or they built just a bigger sensor inside these drones, because you're gonna get some aliasing moire and things like this where it just doesn't look quite right. But I realize for most beginners and people who don't know and people who aren't serious about filmmaking, they may not notice or understand this. So they say, oh, it looks sharp, it looks great. For us serious filmmakers, it's a little too much sharpening. And then overall in D-Log and D-Cine, like, they seem very close. They seem almost, the contrast issue isn't as pronounced as in just shooting normal mode. They're pretty much, the contrast and the highlights is almost the same when shooting in log. So if you're gonna shoot in log, you'll probably get very similar results. I would say the color tones look better with the Mini 3 Pro, but it has a little more sharpening, which I didn't quite like. If I had to pick a drone now, looking at them side by side, I'd say the Mini 3 Pro, I'd choose it because of the colors, because it's quieter so I can get closer to objects. And if I'm just shooting in normal mode, it has a lot more detail in the shadows. And now with 10-bit D-Cine-like mode, the Air 2S doesn't have too much of an advantage except the fact that its sensor is slightly bigger. Mini 3 Pro has a 1.7 lens, which is much better than the 2.8 lens aperture on the Air 2S. I would rather have a better lens and just a slightly smaller sensor, but get much better colors and more dynamic range, it looks like. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I do appreciate you watching. If you enjoyed it, give a thumbs up. And if you think this video might help someone else in choosing between the Air 2S and the Mini 3 Pro, share it with them. And don't forget to give it a thumbs up. It really helps the algorithm, and I appreciate your support. And if you do decide to buy either one of these drones, I get a small kickback when you use that link, and it's at no extra cost to you. So I do appreciate that. It helps support this channel. I'm Prek Aramella, and remember, fly like a pro.